She is a graduate from London School of Economics, served at the Obama administration as senior advisor.
The power of storytelling in being able to unite people from different parts of the world and bring empathy.
Currently, she is Executive Vice President of Strategy and Global Operations at Motion Picture Association.
It is always very difficult when you come to a new place, a new city, trying to forge those connections.
NewsX proudly presents the VaKu Diaspora Dialogue with Urmila Venugopalan.
Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX VaKu. My name is Megha Sharma, and joining me on the broadcast is a very special guest all the way from Washington, D.C., Columbia. Her name is Urmila Venugopalan. She's the Executive Vice President, Global Operations and Strategy at Motion Pictures Association. She's a graduate from London School of Economics and Political Science. It's great to have you, Urmila, on the broadcast with us.
Thank you, Megha. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Urmila, my first question to you would be, was it the American dream that pushed you to come to the United States and finally get a degree in London School of Economics and Political Science and doing all the fabulous work that you're doing right now?
Thank you, Megha. It's a great question. I actually moved to Washington, D.C. a decade ago. And prior to that, I had never lived in the United States. And so prior to that, I had lived in the Middle East. I had lived and worked in Europe. And coming to Washington, D.C. 10 years ago was definitely exciting, but also quite daunting. And my career arc in Washington and generally globally has followed a specific theme, and that has been operating at the intersection of global business and public policy. So right now, I'm the Executive Vice President of the Motion Picture Association, overseeing our corporate strategy and all our overseas operations. And prior to that, I was at the Albright Stonebridge Group, working as a senior consultant. And I've also worked for the Obama administration, including working for Secretary Kerry's policy planning staff, covering trade and economic policy. So I think generally being at that intersection of business and government is something that is particularly unique in Washington, D.C. Many people do that. And so I've been fortunate to have sort of follow that trend throughout my career here in DC.
That's interesting. That's interesting that you mentioned that you worked your degree in public policy, international relations, and then working through the entire wide spectrum from politics to now corporate. And in corporate as well, it's a very dynamic field that you are in. The media is continuously changing, the OTT platforms, social media, etc., etc. How have you been able to accommodate your skill sets to the kind of job that you entail?
I think essentially, at the Motion Picture Association, we represent the largest content creators in the world. As you know, our members are Sony, Paramount, Disney, NBCU, Netflix, Warner. And so, this industry is a global industry, and we have, we have operations across the world representing all of our members. And the media and entertainment landscape has gone through major shifts and continues to evolve. But I think the one thing that the pandemic has really reinforced, and which our industry is reinforcing every day, is the power of storytelling, right? And the power of storytelling in being able to unite people from different parts of the world and bring empathy, and specifically the importance and the value and the magic of local storytelling, and that local storytelling can actually travel globally and can be incredibly successful. And, the industry that I'm part of, all of our members are investing vast amounts of money in local programming, and India is one of the major markets.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And it's also good to understand that you are amongst those bunch of people, those small selected people who are actually taking a look at the kind of content that is going across on OTTs and Netflix and so many other platforms that you are at this point in time heralding, and also molding the kind of content that comes especially in India or in the Asian markets. Also, since you talk about, you've lived in different parts of the world, how challenging was it to then deciding to move from a UAE to Europe and then to United States of America? Was it easy for you because of the fact that now that you're a global citizen, so it comes just very naturally to you? Or are there any sort of peculiarities for a particular country or a particular city that you actually decided to shift to, and now building your base, like you said, for the past 10 years in America?
I think it's a really good question. Thank you for that. I am part of a generation of diaspora Indians that have lived most, if not all of our lives, raised and educated outside of India, yet have a very strong connection to India through family ties, academic pursuits, professional pursuits. And so I think I've been moving around the world for so long, personally and professionally, and my husband's a US diplomat. And so as a result, I think it is always very difficult when you come to a new place, a new city, trying to forge those connections, trying to create your networks from scratch. And having never lived in the United States before, it was very difficult and it was a real challenge. Mm-hmm. But I think because I've always, as I mentioned before, because I've always operated at that intersection of public policy and government and global business, I think Washington, D.C. is really that perfect hub where many people are operating at that intersection. And so it's been relatively sort of easy compared to other cities. And as you may know, Washington, D.C. is a hub of networking. So it was a challenge, but it was also quite enjoyable.
And do you feel you have lived quite a considerable time now in Washington? And do you also feel that there is a perceptual shift in the way Americans look at the Indian community, the community living in America, and also the Indian community living in India? And what has brought about that transformational change in the last few years?
So I think going back to the economic reforms of 1991 in India, India's relationship with other countries, including the US, they've just become stronger and deeper over the past sort of several decades. And, as you see between India and the US, commercial ties, people-to-people ties, educational ties have only gotten stronger and deeper. And they've gotten stronger and deeper in a way that makes it possible, I think, for Indians to better understand other countries, as well as those countries being able to better understand India and Indian society. Mm. And if you just take a look at some of the statistics, which I'm sure you know well, in US-India bilateral trade in goods and services is worth over 150 billion at the moment. Last year, Indian students enrolled at US colleges and universities contributed around $8 billion to the US economy. And the total number of Indian students has doubled in the last decade. So I think if you just look at these few examples, and these are just a few, you can kind of imagine the personal and professional sort of relationships between Indians and Americans that have come from these strong ties. And I think they've only gotten deeper. And I think sorry, no, go ahead.
No. I was just listening to you intently and keeping in mind that, there has been a breach that has already been made by Indians, be it hemming the affairs for the big tech companies or being intrinsically involved in the political doings that continue to take place, be it in the Senate, the House of Representatives, or the House of Commons, and you also take a look at Kamala Harris. So that sort of reinstates our belief in the kind of things and the reach that the Indian diaspora community has in America. And keeping in mind the Indian diaspora has the maximum population of the minorities that are living at this point in time, and we contribute a major chunk to the gross domestic product of the country. And keeping in mind the 2021 elections that are taking place, wherein there was a tectonic shift in terms of the postal votings that are taking place. And there were a number of these minority communities, and especially from the Asian community, that had voted strongly, that brought about the change in the dispensation from Trump administration to Biden administration. That is a massively influential community that we're talking about. Has that also allowed for the natives, for Americans, to look at Indians in a different light?
I think so, because I mean, exactly as you said, you know, we've had the election last year of the first Indian American vice president in the form of Kamala Harris, and some of the US's most important and influential political figures, actors, artists, novelists, academics, scientists, doctors, and comedians. I mean, they're all people of Indian descent or Indian origin. And so I think, to me, this representation really does matter, because it reinforces powerfully the idea that we have champions all around us, and that given the right opportunities, we can be, you know, Indian Americans can be successful in every imaginable field.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And do you think there's already a lot that is being done for the Indian community or for the South Asian community in America? But what is it that you would require? What is the impetus that you would look for the polity as well as the community as a whole, for, you know, the betterment of the community, for the welfare of the Indian community per se?
I think, as I mentioned, you know, representation in all these fields sort of really, really matter. And so I think it, you know, it's hard for me to sort of offer any great pearls of wisdom. But as an Indian American, I think the most important thing is to constantly do our small part to reinforce this representation. So whether it's engaging in civic society, or whether it's contributing to the arts, or whether it's, you know, furthering STEM education, I just think, you know, we are in a really fortunate position to have grown in visibility over the past years, and we should continue to do impactful, important work in serving communities, you know, across the country, whether it's domestic or whether it's overseas.
Right, absolutely. And finally, before I let you go, Urmila, what is the one message that you would like to give out to all the Indians living in India, living in America, living across the globe?
I am in no position, I don't think, to sort of offer any pearls of wisdom. I think there are so many millions of Americans millions of Indians that are doing really, really important work, as well as millions of Indian Americans doing important and impactful work in serving their communities. So I don't know if I'm in a position to offer any pearls of wisdom. But as I mentioned before, I think we reached such a milestone with the election of Vice President Kamala Harris, and I really hope that that kind of political representation continues and only grows.
Absolutely. On that note, I thank you so much, Urmila, for joining me on this very special broadcast of NewsX VaKu. I will hope to have you back on the broadcast in the subsequent days and weeks as well, to understand from you as a global Indian, as an Indian who has made a mark, as an Indian American who is doing some fabulous work in our field, about what the geopolitical, what the corporate, what the social scenario is in terms of the Indian community, to making these massive strides when it comes to making India proud. On that note, thank you very much once again for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Megha. It's a pleasure to have been here on your show. Thank you.
He is an experienced strategist who has worked globally, currently working with Atlassian as Senior Manager Strategy.
If I look at the tech at Atlassian where I work, there are a number of executives who are originally from India.
He is a University of New South Wales alumni.
Being able to progress and be really fulfilled in what you're doing, education is paramount, which is a really good thing. You just have to learn to balance that and make sure you're building your relationships as well.
NewsX proudly presents the VaKu Diaspora Dialogue with Sandeep Chandra.
Hello and welcome. You're watching NewsX VaKu. My name is Megha Sharma, and today on the broadcast is a very special guest. His name is Sandeep Chandra. He's an experienced strategist who has worked globally. He has experience across technology, consumer products, retail, government, as well as energy sectors. He's currently residing in Australia. He's passionate about his role that he plays when it comes to the India-Australia ties in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's exactly why he decided to be part of the Australia-India Youth Dialogue Steering Committee since 2019. It's good to have you, Sandeep, on the broadcast with us.
Thanks, Mega. I'm excited to be here.
My first question to you, which part of Australia do you belong to? How long have you been living in Australia? What motivated you to come to this part of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a bit of a controversial answer. I identify as a Queenslander because I spent a lot of my time growing up in Brisbane, but I live in Sydney and I call Sydney home. And as far as I can tell, I'm going to always call Sydney home. So, you know, at certain times of the year, I think calling yourself a Queenslander makes yourself a little bit unpopular, but I think sort of my loyalties are split between Brisbane and Sydney, but I live in Sydney with my family, and I love being here. Been in Australia since '89. So my parents migrated when I was 2. We moved to Melbourne originally, then sort of moved around Australia, but sort of ended up gravitating towards Sydney, which is just a beautiful city to live in.
To complete my second part of the question, what motivated you to come to Australia, living in Brisbane and Sydney for I don't know how many years that you have been settled over there for, and how has that entire experience been like professionally and personally?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the motivation came from my parents. Sort of they moved when I was 2, so I didn't get too much input into the decision, but it was a family, I guess, lifestyle and upbringing decision. So my sister lives in Sydney as well. She was born in Australia. I was born in Bangalore, and sort of moving around Australia gave me an appreciation for I guess different styles of living. So we lived in metro areas, we lived in rural areas. I loved both. And so doing high school in country New South Wales, a small town called Orange, was what a fantastic experience that was. But it also showed me that I wanted to be in Sydney professionally. And so sort of the formative years were kind of in Melbourne, Brisbane, Orange, but then my professional years, if you like, have been in Sydney. So I went to university at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, got my job here, and then I've had a few sort of changes in direction during my career, but sort of all of them have led me to just better, more motivating things in my view, and all of which are in Sydney. So it's the city that I think that I will be calling home for a while yet.
Sandeep, also talk to us about your work. What exactly is it that you do? You talked to me about working for government as well as energy sectors, retail, consumer products, technology. Is that what is something that you enjoy doing, passionate about, and what tipped you towards this direction?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for Atlassian, a great Australian tech company headquartered in Sydney. And so we make team collaboration software, and it's just a fantastic place to work. And I'm really lucky to have found a role in the strategy team at Atlassian. But the reason there's a long list of sectors that I've worked in is because I spent 8 or 9 years in management consulting before I joined Atlassian. And so I spent a number of years at Deloitte and boutique consulting before that. And it was just an amazing experience to be part of a really energizing, high-performing sector and place to work in consulting. And it was also the trigger for me to get an interest in the Asia-Pacific region. And so working on the corporate side of multilateral diplomacy, it almost felt like I was working for the UN on certain projects, in the way we were working with business leaders from 7 countries with competing priorities, with a mutually agreed goal in mind, and that was just an amazing experience. And so I thought, I would like to get involved in this in a meaningful way and work with young people consistently in that space. And that's what led me to the Australia-India Youth Dialogue as well. So consulting kind of really was an eye-opening experience for what was for what was going on between countries and how people really make decisions on a macro scale. And then the shift to Atlassian was really my interest in tech and strategy coming together. So doing some really fantastic work for a multinational tech company based in Sydney. Just really, it's reasonably new. I've been here about 4 months, just over 4 months, and absolutely loving it. So it's
and are there a lot of Indian Australians that are working in your organization, especially or in the industry that you specialize in, technology, corporate management, corporate policy making, public policy making? Has there been a tectonic shift in the percentage of Indians living in Australia and picking up these jobs?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you talk about the tech industry, I think that's what a lot of expat Indians are almost famous for, right? But if I look at the tech at Atlassian where I work, there are a number of executives who are originally from India, and it's always cool to see an Indian name when they announce a new leadership position. But I think there's definitely a lot of goodwill and a lot of history in people bringing in Indian leadership for within tech companies, and we can see that across. You look at Microsoft, look at Google. You can name. There's a whole list of tech companies you could list that have Indian executives, and so that brand seems to be developing very strongly now. And so we definitely see that in the US. And I'm starting to see that a lot now in Australia. So Australian tech company as well now showing that trend as well. So I think we're probably a little bit behind the US in terms of the representation at executive and board levels, but the trend is definitely observable from what I've seen.
That's brilliant. You've talked about you getting a hands-on experience when it came to corporate policy making, which also put you in touch with diplomacy about the Indo-Pacific region, Asia-Pacific region on a larger scale. Was that also a reason behind the incentive that you had to join the Australia-India Youth Dialogue back in 2019?
Yeah, absolutely. Working on on large M&A transactions across the region was super interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it really gave me clarity on how people make decisions and what motivates people to make decisions when they're in negotiations with such a wide variety of people, wide variety of countries, of business cultures, of languages, and you're trying to orchestrate a massive deal across 7 countries. How do people make decisions in that setting is a really interesting thing that sort of you get to know. But the other thing as well is then what role do each of these country leaders play in that decision making? And I was really fascinated to see the role that, for example, the Australian leaders and the Indian leaders were playing in those discussions. And my mind immediately went to, what does the next wave of this look like? What does the next generation of these leaders look like? And who's helping work with that next generation of leaders? And how can I get into this? That was definitely a trigger for wanting to be more involved. And then as I became aware of the AOYD and our mission and the rich history of bringing together young people between Australia and India, I thought, this is a perfect fit for what I've just become interested in. And I've been involved now for a few years and have loved being involved.
Okay, that's interesting. Are there any specific ideas, objectives, goals that your community building that you have created by way of Australia-India Youth Dialogue looking to achieve in the coming months, years, perhaps also dealing with the policy makers in allowing for welfare and benefit of the Indian community living in Australia, specifically Sydney?
Yeah, so one thing I guess definitely to note is that we are approaching our 10th dialogue as an organization in early next year, which is a really exciting milestone for us to hit. And so I think the elephant in the room, if you're going to be having multilateral talks at this point, is the COVID recovery. And so what is the role of young people in both of our countries to assist with and accelerate the recovery from the pandemic? And so we've got a number of ideas that we're working on for how we can sort of feed into the policy discussion in both countries. And so there are themes such as economic equality. So we've seen that the economic recovery is not felt evenly across sectors, across communities in both Australia and India. And so, what are the priorities that we need to be aware of, and how can the young people in both countries feed into decision making in that sense? Building back greener and a bit more sustainably, I think, or a lot more sustainably. I think with COP26, we've seen the spotlight has been put on every country to really increase the role they're playing in a green recovery. And so there's a burning question there about what is the role of young people to accelerate that theme and that agenda as well. And I think one of the other themes that we've been kicking around to include as part of the dialogue is how do we build back together and regain that connection that we have invariably lost through the pandemic. And so obviously through media like video conferencing, we can maintain a certain amount of connection, but you lose a lot of that people to people ties that you get when you have diaspora that aren't allowed to move around. And so I think it's a really important question about how young people can play a role in regaining that connection between countries, and something that I'm sure we'll be putting front and center at the dialogue. So there's a few themes that we're looking at for what young people can do in the space, and we're really excited to have our 10th dialogue next year, and I think it's going to be a one to remember.
Okay, all right. Those are all important, pertinent issues that you raise, especially when it comes to the Indian community and the relationship that also needs to be given the impetus between India and Australia. Not to mention, this is obviously discussed at diplomatic levels and the Ministry of External Affairs levels and Prime Minister levels, be it the meetings that have happened virtually and physically between Prime Minister Modi and Scott Morrison. So obviously the ball starts to turn and move, and it gives a massive impact even at the corporate levels. Like you said, technology and several other public policy aspects as well. And finally, before I let you go, Sandeep, I would like to also understand from you a message that you would like to give to Indian Australians. You are a second generation Indian Australian. Obviously, the challenges that you might have faced in settling yourself, your family, your professional career, and personal life would be much lesser than perhaps what your parents have had to go through. Bringing their roots together in an alien land, and also to those who are watching this broadcast in India and looking to diversify, become the next diaspora generation in Australia. What is it that you would like to tell them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my experience, I guess, professionally in Australia has shown that being able to progress and be really fulfilled in what you're doing, education is paramount, which is a really good thing. You just have to learn to balance that and make sure you're building your relationships as well.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Sandeep, and it's good to have you on the broadcast, share your experiences as an Indian Australian, and sending out that very important, crucial message to everybody who's watching this diaspora broadcast on the NewsX VaKu Diaspora Broadcasting Network.
NewsX ITV network have proudly launched the VaKu Diaspora Broadcasting Network.
VaKu DBN will be India's first mainstream platform dedicated to the diaspora community. Help support us, become VaKu patrons at memboro.com/VaKu. You will get the first access to our interviews, make recommendations, merchandise access, ask questions, and get a shout out of thanks on our TV shows.
You can also suggest to us who should get the VaKu Golden Chakra Awards, and also tell us who should get into the VaKu Hall of Fame. Limited memberships are available at 100 rupees per month on Memboro VaKu.
Sign up now, log on to memboro.com/VaKu.